tomorrow's a better day. Fuck me.
Uganda's independence illusion. Our arguments favored Britain and betrayed Ugandans. When Uganda hoisted its black, yellow, and red flag on October the 9th, 1962, the moment was celebrated as the triumph of African nationalism over British colonialism. Yet behind the cheers and parades lay a significant betrayal, a wave of political and economic agreements that ensured Britain's grip on Uganda would persist long after the Union Jack came down. The independence handed to Milton Obote's government was not the liberation Ugandans had fought and dreamed for. It was a carefully managed transfer of power designed to protect British interests and suppress true sovereignty. The first thing that I need to say is the roots of dependence, the Uganda Agreement of 1900. The story of Uganda's subjugation under British influence began long before independence. The 1900 Buganda Agreement, signed between Sir Harry Johnston on behalf of the British Crown and Uganda's chiefs, laid the cornerstone of colonial control. Under this pact, Britain recognized the Kabaka, that's King of Uganda, and his chiefs as partners in governance, but only under the authority of the British Protectorate. Through the infamous Melo land course of 8,000 square miles of land were handed to Buganda's chiefs and collaborators, while ordinary peasants became tenants on their own ancestral soil. This agreement effectively created a loyal African aristocracy that would serve as Britain's local administrators. The land question born from that deal still owns Uganda today, as thousands remain landless, descendants of those who lost property in 1900. The Buganda Agreement was not just a treaty, it was the economic and political blueprint to colonial domination. By turning Buganda into a privileged ally, Britain secured the ability to govern the rest of Uganda through division of manipulation and tribalism, the famous divide and rule strategy that crippled African unity for decades. The second thing is, let's see the replicating control, Toro and Acholi agreements. Soon after the Buganda deal, the British extended their formula to other kingdoms. The Toro Agreement of 1901 and the Acholi Agreement of 1900 rewarded loyal chiefs with power and recognition in exchange for allegiance to the protectorate. Instead of building a unified Uganda, these deals cemented regional fragmentation. Each kingdom had its own arrangement with the British, ensuring that no Central African voice could rise strong enough to challenge colonial rule. The fragmentation later became one of independent Uganda's greatest weaknesses. Tribal and regional divisions that leaders like Milton Obote exploited rather than resolved. The third thing that is worth talking is the 1955 Buganda Agreement, that is Britain's insurance policy. By the 1950s, anti-colonial sentiment was spreading across Africa. The British, seeing the writing on the wall, began preparing Uganda for a controlled transition. But Buganda, still powerful, resisted deeper integration into a centralized Uganda. The 1955 Buganda Agreement, negotiated by Governor Sir Andrew Cohen, was Britain's masterstroke. After exiling Kabaka Mutesa II for defying colonial authority, Britain reinstated him, but only under strict terms. The Kabaka could return, but his powers were curtailed, and Britain maintained full control over security, foreign policy, and finance. This agreement pacified Uganda while preserving British oversight. It was a political sedative, calming potential unrest and buying time for London to manage Uganda's approaching independence on its own terms. The fourth thing worth talking about is the Lancaster House negotiations. That's 1961 to 1962. Freedom on a leash. The talks that decided Uganda's independence took place in London, not Kampala. Delegates from the Uganda's People's Congress, that's UPC, the Democratic Party, that's DP, and the Kabaka Yeka, that's KY Party, sat across from British officials at Lancaster House, discussing the shape of Uganda's future. But the agenda, procedures, and even the final constitution were drafted largely by the British Colonial Office. So both did not fight like the Mamo and the rest. The resulting 1962 independence constitution looked African on the surface but was deeply colonial at its core. First thing you must remember, Uganda remained within the British Commonwealth, recognizing the British monarch as symbolic head. Secondly, a British governor general served as head of state until 1963. Thirdly, British military officers retained key command roles in the newly formed Ugandan army. Fourthly, the country's legal and parliamentary systems were carbon copies of British models. There were no provisions for land reform, meaning the exploitative land ownership created by the 1900 Buganda Agreement remained untouched. Economic power in coffee, cotton, and banking stayed in the hands of British and Asian companies. Independence, therefore, was political theater. The script, stage, and lighting all belonged to Britain. The fifth thing that I must talk about is the economic dependence. What are the hidden chains? After independence, Uganda's economy remained an extension of the British Empire's commercial network. British firms such as Shell BP, Barclays Bank, and Uganda Company Limited retained monopolies in energy, finance, and trade. The Ugandan currency was tied to the British pound sterling through the East African Currency Board, headquartered in London. British technical advisors were embodied in ministries of finance, agriculture, and justice. Even the Ugandan army, modeled after the colonial king's African rifle, was trained and led by British officers. The colonial skeleton remained intact, only the political skin had changed. Milton Obote, the country's first prime minister, inherited this structure and instead of dismantling it, used it to consolidate power. His early rule was characterized by cooperation with British officials, dependence on Western aid, and continuation of the colonial economic model. The sixth thing is defense and Commonwealth agreements, soft power control. In the years following independence, Uganda signed several defense and technical assistance agreements with Britain. This allowed British military experts to remain in charge of training the Ugandan armed forces. Through these deals, Britain preserved its influence in Uganda's security apparatus, ensuring that any regime that rose to power would remain within Western strategic orbit during the Cold War. At the same time, Uganda's membership in the Commonwealth reinforced psychological dependence. The country adopted British-style education, law, and civil service systems. Even the official language, English, symbolized the enduring dominance of British culture over indigenous identity. But of course, language is good for business. And now, since they colonized most part, English is dominant across the world. The seventh thing is the legacy, a sovereignty stolen by design. By the late 1960s, Milton Obote began realizing the trap he had inherited. His Common Man's Charter of 1969 attempted to reclaim economic control through socialist reforms and nationalization of foreign assets, but it was too late. The political and economic foundations of new colonialism were too deeply rooted, and his own government had become entangled in corruption and tribalism. Uganda's post independence turbulence, from coups to civil wars, can be treated to these early compromises. The British had built a system where African leaders ruled but Britain reigned. Every agreement signed from 1900 to 1962 ensured that Uganda's sovereignty would be superficial and conditional. In conclusion, Uganda's independence was never a clean break from colonialism. It was a calculated transfer from direct control to disguised dominance. The agreement signed in London and Entebbe, the land pacts in Buganda and Toro, and the defense treaties after 1962 all served one master, British interests. Milton Obote may have been Uganda's first post-colonial leader, but he governed within a framework designed to limit its freedom. True liberation for Uganda, political, economic, and psychological, would require undoing a century's worth of agreements made in favor of the colonizer and at the expense of the colonized. So for now, Uganda is not independent, and Uganda is still being colonized.